Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. I'm Terry Campbell. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator here at the library. Tonight's program, Nature Speaks, is a series of programs throughout the year that's partnered with the Prospect Heights Natural Resource Commission. Save the date for the next one. It's going to be on Tuesday, January 23rd. We have Stephen Packard coming to talk about rare animals, plants, and people adventures in Chicagoland conservation. So that's Tuesday, January 23rd. I also want to mention that next Thursday, we have, for those Beetle fans out there, we have Professor Mop Top from WXRT, and he's going to be talking about the Magical Mystery Tour. Believe it or not, it's been 50 years since the Beatles album Magical Mystery Tour came out, so join us next Thursday.
Okay.
Tonight's speaker, we're talking about botanical citizen science, its impacts, and how to get involved. And we have Rachel Goad here, the manager of Plants of Concern, that's headquartered at the Chicago Botanic Garden. So please welcome Rachel Goad.
Hello. Can people hear me if I'm not by that microphone? Yeah? Okay, great. Well, I'm glad to be here today, talk to you about a few different things. So yeah, I manage the Plants of Concern program at the Chicago Botanic Garden. I'm also involved with the Illinois Native Plant Society, so I'll end up plugging them a little bit shamelessly as well. So turn that on, and we're in business. Okay, so I guess we'll start with the purpose behind doing any sort of botanical work. We actually don't know how many species exist on Earth. We think maybe there's 450,000 plant species. And of those, people who are much smarter than me estimate that maybe a third of them are at risk of extinction. So that's a pretty huge chunk of our plant biodiversity that we think could be imperiled. These are just a suite of some of the species that we monitor with Plants of Concern, and some of them are very, very rare as well. And one of the biggest reasons for rarity in many species is loss of habitat. So here we are in the Prairie State in Illinois. And this is a map that shows you what pre-settlement prairie looked like in Illinois. So everything in black there on that map is where we think prairie once existed. And that data came from land survey records, which were done in about 1810, 1820. So there was already some change to the landscape that had happened from European settlers at that time. But you can see it's still a huge amount of Illinois was prairie. That's about 60% of our state. You can imagine that map looks very different now. 99.9% of our prairie is gone in Illinois, and that's kind of a hard number to get your head around, so here's my attempt to help you get your head around that. Imagine this is an 8.5 by 11 inch sheet of paper, and that's a little lowercase o in the middle of the paper, and if we color half of that in, that's how much prairie is left in Illinois. But that's not really the whole story, because it's also scattered in tiny fragments around the state. I was talking to someone a little earlier about like Woodworth Prairie, if folks have been there, or Tucson Prairie Grove. You've seen that there are these very small areas that hold that biodiversity for us. And so you can imagine if you're a rare plant species that occurs in one of these places, you've got some significant challenges. The other plants that you might mate with might not be anywhere close to you. Your population might be very small, and you're going to be more susceptible to threats like invasive species and pollution and things like that. So there's a lot of reason to be concerned about the remnant native species that we have. So a lot of people have looked at this in terms of climate change and tried to see how can we understand which species are going to be most vulnerable to climate change. How should we think about protecting things? And this is a quote from a paper that was all about that was all focusing on climate change vulnerability. And the biggest challenge in assessing plant species data, according to these folks, is the lack of available data. So we don't know enough in order to know how to prioritize or figure out how to conserve these things. So the kinds of information needed, we need occurrence information. So where do these things occur? Life history information, how are they living from year to year? And also data is needed that's both extensive, so ideally nationwide we have a sense of what's happening with many of these species, but also fine scale. This is us at Meadows National Tallgrass Prairie doing some data collection, so you can see what I mean by fine scale, down on hands and knees. So there's a big need for that. So this is where citizen science comes in. There are many citizen science programs that have started now, and one of the benefits is the ability to engage people in big problems like this and leverage the ability to address them on a broader scale. So citizen science is non-professional scientists who, participating in research, and it's often observational instead of experimental, usually going out and measuring what it is you see on a given day. But I'm going to give you a little more, I'll back up and talk a little more about citizen science more broadly for a minute. So there's this huge movement in citizen science with getting people involved in different kinds of research, and I think about this as kind of two main groups of citizen science projects. And one of them, the one group, has a lot of projects that are online. Many of them focus on image recognition. It turns out computers aren't very good at image recognition, but people are. So like Galaxy Zoo is one thing that gets talked about a lot, where you have citizen scientists classifying and identifying new galaxies, because they're just going through all of these millions of pictures that have been taken. And there's a lot of gamification, which is a word I love. So turning these tasks into games that people engage in. So that's one whole universe of citizen science that a lot of people get involved in. And the other universe that I'm mostly involved in is this group, which is more on-the-ground work. It's often observational work, and it's mostly focused around natural history questions. So the three that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to primarily focus on Plants of Concern and Project Budburst, which are both citizen science programs at the Chicago Botanic Garden. But I also want to talk a little bit about eBird. Do folks in here know about eBird? No? Oh, cool, great. Well, I'll tell you about that, because it's been sort of a pioneer in this kind of citizen science. So, arguably the earliest citizen science project is the Christmas bird count, which started in response to a lot of hunting that was happening of birds and a growing consciousness of people that we needed to intentionally pay attention to and conserve bird species. And so in 1900, 27 people went out and counted all of the birds that they could find on Christmas. Last year, more than 73,000 people participated in that. And it's this huge community of people that also participate in this eBird program. And eBird has been pioneering in many different ways, just engaging a global community of people who are interested in birds and getting them to submit their data, and then they do really cool things with data, which I didn't test this, so hopefully this is going to work. But I want to show you this video. So we'll see if this is going to let me do it. No! That'll teach me to test. Okay, so this is your homework. This is on YouTube. You can look for indigo bunting migration. And so I mentioned that eBird was pioneering in terms of getting lots and lots of people to submit observations. What they've been able to do with that is something that I think people never thought we'd be able to do, which is see migration in real time. So this is a really amazing video that takes all of those observations over the course of a season and shows you how indigo buntings migrate into the United States and out of the United States. So you can go find that on YouTube later. It's pretty neat. So it's been, in general, I think it's a lot easier to engage people in issues around animals than it is around plants. And this is one illustration of that. But there is a significant need to figure out how to engage people around plants. This is a graph that shows you, so this is a graph from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what it's showing you is the speed at which different species can move So up here, species are able to move fast. So these are mammals up here. They can move pretty quickly. And then these different lines are just sort of like thresholds for different scenarios related to climate change. What's important here is that plants do a terrible job at this. So these bars are sort of high, but these are upper limits. The median speed at which trees and herbaceous plants can move is very low. So in terms of thinking about what is happening to our planet and what will happen to our plant communities, or to our biotic communities, plants in particular are something that we need to be concerned about. So we've got some big changes predicted for here in Illinois, and so this was back in 2010, some research that was done that predicted that we should see increases in temperatures by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and those biggest changes will be during the winter months. And precipitation is not expected to be very different in the near term, but by the end of the century, we should have an overall increase in winter precipitation and less snowfall as well, and more severe storms. We also expect summer precipitation could decline some, so perhaps more droughts in the summer. And by 2020, they think we could have an ice-free Lake Michigan with some regularity. So those are a lot of big changes that are expected for our region. So I said before that it's been easier to engage people around issues related to animal conservation than it has been around plant conservation, but this is one of the exceptions. This is a blooming cherry blossom tree, which I think must be so old that it's being like propped up by things. So cherry bloom is something that's been tracked, especially in Japan, for a really long time. These are, culturally important trees. They're beautiful. They're showy. They bloom early in the spring. And an interesting thing about them is they respond much more strongly to temperature than they do to photo period or any other sort of cue. So they're very susceptible to changes that can occur during the springtime. So in Japan, in Kyoto, they've been tracking cherry bloom dates since the 9th century. That is a long time ago. Tracking and writing them down. And so some people have looked at this data and seen some pretty interesting things. One, there's a whole lot of variation. So you can see that, the things are all over the map here, even a long time ago. But it turns out that there's really not too much of a consistent trend all the way up to 1900. And then once we get to 1900, there's a considerable trend towards earlier and earlier bloom dates for cherry blossoms. So another example of people being engaged with phenology of plants and citizen scientists doing this work is at Walden Pond. So some of you might recognize this guy, Henry David Thoreau. He was tracking 500 species, 500 different species, and when they first bloomed in the spring out at Walden Pond, which I didn't ever realize that it was that many species that he was tracking at the same time. But in addition to him doing that tracking, a follower of his, a really interesting guy who took this picture, Alfred Hosmer, who's also a botanist, he picked up where Thoreau left off and collected that data for a few more years. And then some scientists continued those observations into the early 2000s. So there's a pretty long stretch of data that was collected there. And they found that across that time, plants were flowering on average about 7 days earlier than they were in the 1800s, but that species were responding differently. So they were having sort of individual responses to these temperature changes that were happening. And something I thought was interesting is that they point out in this paper that high bush blueberries, that they were the most sensitive, and that they could potentially be used as like an indicator in other places of what's happening with climatic change, because they were so responsive across years. So, yeah, so these sorts of, I'm going to back up and just give a little context here. So I've mostly been talking about phenology at this point, which is the timing of life cycle events. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about distribution, and this is how these two programs that I'm discussing sort of fit in. So Project Budburst is really, again, focused on phenology, so the timing of life cycle events when things first bloom. And it's really continuing these two projects that I just mentioned, things like the Cherry Bloom Project and things like the Walden Project. And then Plants of Concern is much more focused on distribution, and particularly of rare species. Looking at things like extinction and colonization, so where do rare plants blip out and where do they start growing, and what sort of population dynamics are there? Are populations seeming to do well, or are they declining in different places? So we'll start off, I'll just talk a little more about Budburst, and then we'll get into Plants of Concern. So Project Budburst is a plant phenology citizen science program, and it fairly newly lives at the Chicago Botanic Garden just as of this past year. It's got a national scope and an educational focus, so if anybody here does education work, there's a lot of really great resources on Budburst's website about bringing it into the classroom and how especially younger people can get engaged with the project. The data is scientifically applicable. It's been used in a number of research studies. And if you are so inclined, you could download the data yourself and do your own research and analysis if you feel that excited by it. It's got a new website that will be coming soon as well. When you go to their website, you'll see it looks a little bit like it might have been built in 1997, but it's something flashy and exciting is coming soon. So it has been around for quite a while, I think about a decade, so over 70,000 observations, 25,000 participants across all 50 states. A lot of strategic partnerships to try to get Budburst engaged in parks and refuges, and also classrooms, as I mentioned, and has been used in scientific research. And I'll give you an example of that. So we talked about the cherry blossom work. This is finicky today. We talked about the cherry blossom work going backwards, so talking about what the data that was collected in the 9th century all the way up to present day. But there's also work that's been done to model that going forward. How can we use it to predict what will happen in the future? So this was some data that incorporated Budburst observations looking at future bloom time, particularly around Washington, D.C. Has anybody ever been to D.C. for the Cherry Blossom Festival? Heard about that? Yeah. So I've also heard about it, but I've also heard that in the past number of years, it's a big thing they plan for. It's an event. You can't just guess when it's going to be. You have to make a plan and make the reservations, and then if the cherry trees don't bloom, sorry, So this was some work to look at that. And in the past, if we look at DC, so these maps show the different colors correspond to different times of peak bloom. So in the past, Washington, D.C. had cherry blossoms that bloomed around, beginning mid-April, and then these predictions are that under a low emission scenario, by the end of the century, will be towards maybe mid-March, and then under a high emission scenario, will be closer to the beginning of March. So I had some colleagues who were in D.C. earlier this year, and cherry blossoms were blooming at the end of March. So that's certainly more in this range. We know there's a lot of natural variation in how those bloom times will work, but that does seem to be in line with a trend that we're expecting going forward. But you can get on Project Budburst and watch your own cherry trees and let us know what you think as well. So what about our wildflowers here in Illinois? So this was some work that looked at that in particular. So this is a group of species that get a lot of data submitted from Project Budburst. And we compared earliest flowering observations between Swink and Wilhelm's Plants of the Chicago Region, which that book came out in '94, but the bloom dates that are in there are from 1950 to 1994. Comparing that to data collected from Project Budburst through 2012. And you'll see we've got some pretty significantly advanced dates for some species, lilacs and forsythias, blooming 40 and 44 days earlier, and other things not quite that much different, which this variation in and of itself tells you, like we talked about earlier, that there may be differences to how these plant communities interact over time because they're responding differently. And a lot of people talk about like mismatch with insect pollinators as well, which is another concern when we have so much aberration in bloom dates. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about distribution. So this was the other aspect that I mentioned of botanical citizen science that I'm focusing on today. So distributional changes are much slower than phenology. Phenology responses are sort of lightning fast, plants responding to what happens in that given spring. And a lot of the observed changes have happened in alpine species, at least things that have been published. And it's because you have very short area across which things change a good deal. So there's been a lot of research that shows that tree lines are shifting, and different species are shifting and sort of being, people talk about them being sort of pushed off the earth because you can't go up any higher, for instance. But in general, predicted changes for plant communities say that they should shift poleward. Generally, for us, we think things should shift northward. But that, again, species will have different responses from each other, most likely, and resulting in some changes to the plant communities that we are used to seeing. And there's also some prediction of increased extinction risk for rare species, which further emphasizes the need to understand these species so we can figure out what it is we can do to help preserve them. So Plants of Concern was founded in order to help do that back in 2000. It was really in response to the need for data. Chicago Wilderness Biodiversity Recovery Plan came out in 1999, and that was one of the things that was really called out as something that was missing. We just didn't really understand enough about these things. So since that time, our program has grown a good deal. All of these dots are places where we're collecting data. So across northeast Illinois, a bit in northwest Indiana, and we once were doing work in southeast Wisconsin, and Wisconsin has since started a statewide monitoring program that they modeled after us. So we went ahead and passed that along and said, we'll focus here. That's great. And our goals include engaging citizen scientists, so folks who want to help us do this work, to document rare plant diversity. We do that with a standardized data collection protocol. We've got a centralized database where that information is stored. And then we provide that data to folks who need it to better conserve these plants. So the land managers on whose property the data was collected, state agencies who make decisions related to conservation, and researchers who can help us understand even more about what the data tells us. So we've trained over 800, I think we're closer to 900 citizen scientists over the life of the program. And while these folks do extend financial resources that many agencies are just really limited by, it's much more than that. These are folks who learn a great deal and who become ambassadors for conservation in many other ways. They also become experts. Many of them are really experts at the species and the habitats where they work, and we rely on them to really help understand what's happening at these sites and with these species. You can see we have a good time. Sometimes we get caught in downpours. This is the way it goes. And we have of course we have a website, and there's information about volunteering there, but I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the talk too. I have to push this button about 15 times and then it decides to go. There we go. So I mentioned that we document diversity. So we're focusing on both species that are listed by the state of Illinois as threatened and endangered. So these are things that something endangered, the state thinks it could become extirpated in the state, it could disappear. If it's threatened, we think it could become endangered. But then we're also able to focus more locally on things that are just uncommon in our region, but that land managers might be concerned about. So I can talk to the ecologist at Lake County who can tell me this is our only population of X. And maybe that's not a concern in the rest of the state, but it's an important resource for Lake County. And so we can help to track those things on a finer scale. And the data we collect relates to what's happening in the populations. So we go out and we count every single plant. Sometimes it can take a little while in bigger populations. We evaluate what threats exist to these populations. So of course things like invasive species, things like erosion. We record management that's occurring, so whether there's prescribed burning that's happening, for instance. And also spatial location data, so that we can do a lot with mapping these populations and combining that with other spatial data to better understand what might be driving trends that we're seeing. So I mentioned that we provide that data to folks who need it to help conserve these species. So we're working with over 100 land managers, all of the major landowner agencies, Cook County Forest Preserve, Lake County Forest Preserve, McHenry County, and so on. And we work with them closely to figure out what should be monitored, do that monitoring, and we feed that data back to them so they can use it. The goal is for that to have a local impact. So for instance, this is a monitor in Kendall County who went out to collect data and found out that horses were riding directly through the population of rare trillium that he was monitoring. Oh. So he was able to, in addition to submitting that data to us so that we had it and could feed it back to the landowner, he took the additional step of being an advocate directly to the landowner and also went out there with some rope and created a fence, which was great and helpful. But of course, also just invasive species removal and things like prescribed burning in prairies where it's clear that they really need that and haven't had it in a long time. So we also provide data to state agencies, and I think the most important of these to mention is the Natural Heritage Database. So this is the centralized source of information about biological resources in the state. This is housed at the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. They track endangered and threatened populations across Illinois, including of plants, and they incorporate the data that our volunteers collect. That's a really critical thing, and we're really glad to be able to contribute to that. So one thing to mention, we've got these 280 different species that we're monitoring, and although we're not tracking phenology, so we're not looking at responses to climate change in that way, we do have species that are at the edge of their range, and these are things that we're going to be paying really close attention to in the coming number of years to see what happens. Are those populations changing? So things like starflower, which, so this is a distribution map, and you can just pay attention to the green here. So we are here down at the southern edge of the range for starflower. If there are folks who spend time in Wisconsin in natural areas, this may be something that you've seen, and you go, pshaw, that's not rare. It's all over the place. But for us, it is very rare. It's very uncommon. And it could be that with a warming climate, the places where it lives here could become less suitable over time. And Virginia snakeroot is sort of the opposite end of the coin. We are at the northern end of its range. So it will be interesting to see what happens with that species, which is not very common and not doing particularly well in most populations where we're monitoring it. So we wonder, what sort of changes will we see in those populations over time. So now I want to give you a bit of a tour through a number of habitats where we monitor. I'll tell you a bit about their natural history and then some research that we've done with some plant species that occur within them. And we're going to start with Dolomite Prairie. So if folks aren't familiar with Dolomite Prairie, you might look at this and think clearly this is an overgrown parking lot. And I would not blame you. The first time I saw Dolomite Prairie, I thought the same exact thing. There can be large expanses of flat, bare rock, and this is a magnesium-rich carbonate bedrock, so it results in a very specific growing condition for plants. So some of the things we monitor in Dolomite Prairie include Fens sedge and pitcher stitchwort, which this is a really delicate, tiny little early blooming spring annual, and false mallow, which has these really wild sort of like chocolate kiss-shaped seed pods in the late summer. So how on earth do we get Dolomite Prairie? Where does that come from? If you're familiar with the natural history of our region, you might know that we once had something called Glacial Lake Chicago, which was essentially Lake Michigan, but a lot more water when our glaciers were melting. And apparently this happened very quickly in geologic time, that those meltwaters got so full that they overfilled the bathtub of the moraines that were surrounding it. So they broke through the moraines and water gushed down through Illinois. And a number of things happened. Sand was deposited in certain places, but a good amount of soil was removed in other places. So this is one of those places where these glacial meltwaters came through and scoured all of the soil down to bedrock. And so still along the Des Plaines River, we still have places where Dolomite Prairie exists. And so there are species that are adapted to live in these little cracks with a tiny little bit of soil. And there are, of course, parts where you have a little more soil accumulation as well, but it's a really interesting habitat type. So I want to tell you about a weird little plant that occurs on Dolomite Prairie called Butler's quillwort. So this is a fern ally, which means it's related to ferns, which means it reproduces by spores, not by seeds. And it holds its spores in the base of each one of these leaves. And actually, this is the only quillwort that has separate male and female plants. Most quillworts have males and females together. So that's interesting about it. But you can see that if you were not familiar with this plant, or sometimes even if you were, you might see this out in the field somewhere and think it was just some grass. It was just some little grass that's there. But it's a little fern ally. And you can see it's got a really strange distribution. So it occurs down here in Arkansas and Missouri a lot in glades, so also shallow soil habitat. But then we have just a couple of populations up here in northeast Illinois. That's pretty strange, isn't it? So this is endangered in the state, and it requires water both for fertilization and for dispersal of its spores. So its spores are down here in the ground. It needs water to come and help move them around. So it really is dependent on specific hydrological conditions, and many of its populations are in decline. So we had a graduate student who did some research on this, some really interesting research on this. And what she found was that, so she went around and she sampled the plants, the genetics of the plants that were all found in what we called one population. And she found both high genetic diversity and high inbreeding, which seems really strange until you realize that what's happening is there's just hyper-local populations. So we might have a population that's 50 meters by 50 meters, but these plants were only reproducing with the plants that were within a foot of that plant. And so they had become very inbred, but genetically distinct from their neighbor pockets of plants. So this is not an ideal situation for these plants, but if you can restore the connection between these little patches, that would probably be very helpful for these species. So she found that fire and management, which could reduce encroachment by woody species that breaks up that connection, that would do a good deal to help preserve and protect these weird little ferns. You can do it. I believe in you. So I have like, I think 4 or 5 of these, but if y'all have questions as I'm talking to you, please feel free to ask them. So next is gravel hill prairies. So this is another glacial landform that we have around and about the Chicago region. This is another picture of the beautiful lake in the hills fen, which if folks haven't been there, I recommend it highly. So there's a bunch of strange characters who grow on gravel hill prairies, including things like woolly milkweed, which is a plant that very rarely flowers, and when it flowers, very rarely sets seed successfully. And prairie buttercup, which is one of our earliest blooming plants, grows on these gravel hills. Tiny, tiny little flower. And hills thistle, so this is one of our native thistles, and we're going to talk about that thistle a little bit more here. So first of all, to give you a little more context about gravel hills, so also glacially derived, but this is, they come from gravel and other substrate flowing out from glaciers that are melting and being deposited in a given place. So these piles of gravel, you can imagine, they're pretty well drained, and because the gravel itself is calcareous, they've got some calcareous nature to them. And they were always these islands of gravel, but as you can imagine, many of them have been mined for gravel, and also development has impacted and separated some of them, so they're just further isolated. So we talk about hills thistle. There are some like nasty weedy thistles that we fight with that probably are in your garden or a friend's garden. This is one of the very nice thistles that we have, and it's quite short and has quite a big flowering head, so it looks pretty different from any other things. But it's actually a Great Lakes endemic, which means this is the only place that it occurs in the world, is right around the Great Lakes region. You can see we're sort of in the middle of that range there. It's thought to be a monocarpic perennial, meaning that it blooms once and then it dies. Some data that we've collected makes it seem like it can maybe bloom again more than one time. But there are very few flowering plants and the seed viability is really low. So it's clear that there's some problem with this plant. So some researchers at the garden looked at this and they found that it was these populations in the Chicago region are genetically diverse and they're regionally distinct. So they're different from populations that are in Wisconsin, for instance. But they're not reproducing, which is interesting. So the populations themselves seem like they're healthy and they can have a large number of individuals, but they're just not reproducing. So they've been doing some experimental introduction. There's also some people at the garden working on micropropagation of these plants from seeds, doing tissue culture work. So there's a lot of people who are trying to focus on this, and we continue to do a lot of monitoring of this species too. Yeah?
Is this because of climate change, so they are not reproducing?
It's hard to describe that in particular. It has been a problem for a number of years, the lack of reproduction. It seems like it might have something to do with this strange genetic situation that they have. Okay, so we're moving on to beaches and dunes. We don't have a lot in the way of beaches and dunes in Illinois. We don't have a whole lot of coastline in Illinois. So what we do have that's in a natural condition has some species that we are concerned about protecting. One of them being marram grass, which is this main grass that you see here. If you spend any time at any natural areas along the lakeshore, you will surely see Marram grass. This is a state-listed species, and I'm going to talk more about it in just a minute. But there's also a couple of other things that occur on the lakefront that we monitor. Seaside spurge and sea rocket are both, pretty regular members of undisturbed lakefront communities. So marram grass, it is listed as threatened in Illinois, even though it can be quite populous in places where it's allowed to thrive. But it's really keystone in those habitats. You can see in its distribution, it's all around the Great Lakes. It really just hugs the lakeshore. It's a dune building grass that really paves the way for other species to be able to live in these habitats. It stabilizes the sand. It makes the habitat ready for other things that can't handle quite so much dynamism of sand moving around.
That grass couldn't live far away from a sand community.
Say again?
That couldn't live far away from a sand community. You couldn't just plant it in a parking lot. Would it do okay or?
I wouldn't think so, but I'm not sure. I mean, sometimes plants live in these kinds of situations because they're competitively excluded somewhere else, so they might live in loamier soil, but I would suspect that this guy would want the sand because of how its roots move. I don't know. Maybe give it a try and let us know what you find.
Rachel, how deep are the roots on this?
How do you what?
How deep are the roots on this?
So I have seen I've seen a lot of erosion damage from storms, and I've seen roots as deep as maybe 3 feet or 4 feet or so. They mostly, it seems, move laterally. They're not super deep tap roots.
Is it a real fine mesh of root?
Say again?
Is it a real fine mesh of root?
Yeah, so they'll have a lot of fine roots, and they do have thicker, ropier roots because they move by rhizome.
Okay.
So many of the populations will be sort of a few individuals that are all connected below ground. So some folks did some research on this one too, again using plants of concern data but combining that with genetic tools. So they went and sampled populations all around the Great Lakes and found that these natural populations are more diverse than expected, which, as I just mentioned, they grow by rhizome, and so you would think there's not that many individuals in a given place, so it might not be that genetically diverse, but that didn't seem to be the case. There are a lot of different individuals that seem to grow together naturally. And restorations that are including these plants tend to be really different. There tend to be fewer genotypes, and they tend to be different from those that are in remnant communities. So that's definitely something that people are still thinking about and keeping an eye on related to doing beachfront and dune front restoration. Fens and sedge meadows. So these are graminoid wetlands, and they're often calcium rich. You get a pretty rich diversity of plants that occur in habitats like this. One of the charismatic members of these can be white lady slipper orchids, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about those here. So these are perennial orchids, and they were formerly threatened in the state. They were recently delisted back in 2014. It's thought that pollination limitation and also lack of management of their habitats might be some of what contributes to their rarity. And they occur in calcareous prairies and fens. They have been our flagship species since our inception, and they're probably the plant that we've monitored the most of and across the largest area. You can see that we're a bit of a stronghold of their population here in Northeast Illinois. So we've done some work looking at management in response to, or white lady slipper responses to management, and found that that in general populations tend to have more plants when burning and brush removal happens. So that's what this graph is showing you. So this is prescribed burning, didn't occur, did occur, brush removal didn't occur, did occur. And this is then on this axis the average number of individuals. So in both cases, when burning and brush removal occurred, those populations tended to be larger. That's what you would hope to see. That's what I think many land managers who are managing fens and prairies would hope to see. But it's nice to see it borne out in the data, and interesting to see that there's a stronger response of burning as well than brush removal. But that's not the whole story. We had a graduate student who did some work, and she found that in the year after a burn, populations did not flower as much as they did otherwise. So there may be a bit of a trade-off in terms of what plants are doing with their resources when this management occurs. But we have some additional research that I didn't show here that shows that these plants actually get physically bigger. The clumps of plants get physically bigger after burning. So maybe they're putting more energy into vegetative reproduction, which is probably a good thing than in the long term. So on with our lightning tour. We're going to go to Music Prairie now, and this is the prairie type that we really had a lot of at one time in Illinois, and we have very little of because Music Prairie makes very good farmland. So music meaning sort of between wet and dry, a little bit on the moist side, and yeah, we have a few remnants of these left. One of the species that occurs here is eared false foxglove, and this is a really interesting species for a number of reasons. So it's partly interesting because it's an annual and it blooms in the fall. So for a prairie, that's a bit strange because at that point in a prairie, you've got all of your perennials at the height of their robustness and their aggressiveness. And it's a hemiparasite, so it partially steals energy from other plants that are growing near it. It was formerly threatened in the state. It's been removed from the list. Likes moist and mesic prairies, habitat loss, management, insect herbivory are all reasons that we think it's rare. It's been rare in our region. So there was some research done with this one that focused on this tension between single species versus ecosystem level management, and this is sort of a conversation that's gone on for a long time in restoration community. If you manage for the ecosystem, do the plants come along, or do we have to pay attention to the individual plants themselves? And so in this work, they were looking at grassland management, in particular focusing on brush clearing and deer culling. Those are things that the prairie needed, and that this prairie in particular needed, and that benefited the prairie. And they wanted to see, will that also benefit this species? And in fact, it did. There were improved vital rates. The plants flowered more. They produced more viable seed. But because this is an annual species, it really needs a habitat mosaic. And I think that may be the case for a number of the rare prairie species that we have. They need space that becomes really rare in prairies that have been burned regularly and that dominant grasses have taken hold of.
Rachel,
Yeah.
How long is the data collection period?
How long is this?
How long would it take normally to get the data collection? What would be the length of the data collection to come to those conclusions? Is it more than one season, 2 seasons, 3 seasons?
So this work drew on, I think, 10 years of data that we had collected from these plants, where we were tagging individual plants and collecting that data.
Mm-hmm. Do you know how many were involved in the study? Was it just quadrants?
How many? I'm sorry.
How many plants were involved in this in the data collection? Was it just quadrants, or was it a whole area? Or
Good question. So let me think about that. So it was probably like plants a year were tagged at one site for 10 years.
Wow.
I think that's right, but I could get back to you if you're interested in knowing more
Yeah, I'd
precisely.
like to know, yeah, sure.
Yeah, so we had, in addition to the type of monitoring that I've mostly described so far that we do with plants of concern, was going out and counting. For a while, for about a decade, we also did these really intensive tagged plant surveys, and this was one of those things that we tracked individuals across a season, and so that's what fed into this. This is also one that responds really, really strongly to fire. It loves to be burned. Loves it. Okay, the last of my little tour here is up in the Lake Michigan ravines. So I don't know if folks have spent much time in areas of like Glencoe and further north along Lake Michigan. But up there are these ravines, which are a really interesting community type. These are water courses that have cut down through glacial moraines and created these steep V-sided ravines that are special for a number of reasons. One, they're close to the lake, so you've got the lake microclimate. Two, you've got this dramatic topography, which further emphasizes a microclimate. And because at one time we were much colder here, back in the Ice Age, there are species that are sort of northern relics that still hang out on the cool north-facing slopes of these ravines. And many of these are very uncommon species that don't occur in a lot of other places, but they hang out in these ravines where it's still cool for them. This is a really beautiful preserve that I would also recommend if folks are looking for places to go. Has anybody been to Bowen Park in Waukegan? Anybody? Okay, that's on your list. Check that out. And it's a very old ravine, which is maybe a weird thing to say, but you see how it's got a wide, flat bottom? So it's spent a long time forming and sort of flattening out, and it's had the space to do that. So it's a really interesting place to go. Also, I've never seen more skunk cabbage anywhere. So if you're interested in early spring blooming skunk cabbage, that's a place to go. There's some interesting things that grow in here, including two of our native honeysuckles. These are not common native honeysuckles. Fly honeysuckle, which is Diarvilla lanicera, and red honeysuckle, Lanicera dioica. Rough-leaved dogwood, Cornus rugosa, and paper birch. We don't have paper birch in very many places in Illinois. It's mostly just in the northern tier of counties, and these ravines are one spot where they live. So we've actually done a bunch of different things related to ravines. Of course, we've done a lot of rare plant monitoring, looking, especially as I mentioned, on those north-facing slopes, these relic species that hang out there. But we've also looked at plant community responses to restoration. We've started to try to develop a rapid vegetation assessment method for ravines, so a way to help landowners better understand what's happening with the community as a whole without having to have deep and comprehensive botanical expertise. And also a lot of climate change adaptation planning. I mentioned that these are habitats with a microclimate that host northern relic species. So with a changing climate, we might be particularly concerned about some of those things that we know need a cooler climate. We worked with the Field Museum, Alliance for the Great Lakes, and GLISA on some of this. And that's work that's still ongoing as well. Okay, so how's my time here? All right, so I want to talk a little bit about how you could get involved if you're interested in these different things. So for plants of concern, we've got a new monitor training that happens every spring, and we announce them in January. So you can check our website if you want to be on an email list where I will email you and tell you when they're scheduled. We can do that. So we get people to this training workshop, but then we also work out in-field visits to get people oriented to whatever their assignment starts to be. Requirements, we've got a background screening and confidentiality agreement that folks have to go through. And then, an interest in and some background with plants is a requirement, but nobody needs to be I don't expect anyone to be an expert botanist coming into this, and interest in learning and enthusiasm, that's really the biggest thing. And of course, I think I've plugged my website, our website, to you a number of times, but there it is again. So the way that the commitment works is that folks submit paperwork, they agree to a policy of confidentiality, which I haven't talked a lot about, but unfortunately rare plants, especially the more charismatic things like carnivorous plants and orchids, can be in trouble when a lot of people know where they are. Poaching is a real thing that happens too often. So we ask folks not to share the locations of plants that they will be monitoring with us. You're asked to become familiar with your assigned species and its habitat, learning to recognize common threats and invaders. Some of that's covered during the workshop that we have. And then really the minimum is just to visit your population once per year during when it's in bloom. And then of course if you've done all of that, to please be sure to submit that data that you went through all the trouble to collect. And we are always interested in people who think they might want to be involved for multiple years, but of course nobody has a crystal ball, so we don't ask people to sign a contract related to that or anything. Did you have a question? I thought I saw. No? Okay. And then just some different ways that people end up being involved. We coordinate group monitoring forays, so these are often large-scale data collection efforts. So we go to sites where there's big populations, like Illinois Beach State Park, for instance, and they end up also being good ways to do in-field training for folks who are newer, and they really are a really good time. We've got a special project at Meadows where we do a lot of staff-led monitoring. This is during the week, so for folks who work during the week, I know that's harder, but we're always looking for new people who are interested in going there, and especially if Dolomite Prairie piqued your interest at all, it's definitely a thing we'd love to have you out for. We do a lot of monitoring at Openlands Lakeshore Preserve. This is a ravine preserve up in Highland Park, and we do a lot of different things there that volunteers can get involved in. Rare plant monitoring, plant community monitoring, and even bird monitoring, and we're trying to start some bat monitoring next year, so it could be that there's opportunities related to that too. We partner with Cook County Forest Preserve, so there's a lot of opportunities for folks for whom that might be more convenient, and there's a lot of really interesting species and sites in Cook County as well. And then we also, for folks who volunteer with us and get to be comfortable enough to take on their own assignment, we'll give them assignment that they just complete on their own whenever the timing is right. That's always what we aim to move people towards. Most people aren't ready for that at the beginning, but we do have a number of volunteers who work with us that way. In terms of Budburst, if you're interested in getting involved with Budburst, pretty much everything there is online. There's training materials online. You can create an online profile and submit data that way. And like I said, they've got a new website coming. And they've got two main ways to participate. One is a single report. So like you went on a walk and saw something in particular at a new place and you wanted to submit that. So for instance, maybe in the spring you saw red maple start to bloom. So you could just submit that data. But you could also submit a regular report. Like what I do is I have a lilac bush out front of where I live and I watch it and I submit that data every year. And that report looks something like this. So you can just have your sheet of paper and take note of when each one of those stages happens within a given year, and then go ahead and submit that. If you're interested in other ways to get involved, or if you know other people who might have be interested in these different flavors of citizen science that I've mentioned, these are all really great places to look at. SciStarter and Zooniverse are both sort of conglomerate organizations that list a lot of different kinds of citizen science options. And the Field Museum has started to organize a number of different citizen science programs as well. So there's some really interesting things happening at the field. So I think I'm going to go ahead, I'm just going to stop there. But if folks have questions, there's Illinois Native Plant Society, there's plug. check out our website. And of course, lots of people and funders contribute to everything that we're able to do. Yeah, and so I'll take any questions if you have them.
I do.
Yeah.
So Rachel, like, say a person is monitoring these plants, you know, and then they're not doing so good, be it for whatever reason. Is there like an A team? Like, what happens at that point? Like,
Yeah.
you know, if everyone's worried, or what
Yeah.
would you do? Are there have you guys thought that out? Like, are there
Yeah.
other steps and stuff that?
Yeah, absolutely. So since we're working so closely with the land managers of these different sites, we give that data to them, and if it's a particular concern, then we're worried they perhaps won't recognize it in the mix of the other data that we're giving them. Then we will, contact them individually and say, have you noticed X? Are you taking action on X, Y, or Z? We also have some of our volunteers who are engaged at these sites in other ways, like in stewardship capacities, and they're able to help us with that as well, and to help advocate for certain things that they're seeing going on. So there's a number of different avenues, but mostly it's through our direct collaboration with the landowners.
And then my last question, if you can make this kind of judgment, is how do you see things? Are more plants moving towards the endangered? Are plant communities stable? Because they've gone through a lot, I imagine. So are they coping with all this or not?
Yeah. So and can everybody hear with the questions? You guys, okay. It's a hard thing to say. There are some things that are definitely doing better than we thought they were. So for instance, white lady slipper, which we talked about, that's a species that was removed from the endangered and threatened species list in 2014 because it was more common than previously thought.
Oh.
They say either recovered or more common than previously thought. And that was the same story for eared false foxglove. Both species that we've done and our volunteers have done a lot of intensive work finding populations, enumerating populations, and they just weren't that well known before. So I do think management has helped a number of those species. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think there are definitely success stories. Yeah. Yeah.
You know how you showed the pictures of climate change and how Illinois is projected to change in precipitation?
Do you want me to go back to that?
No.
Oh, yeah.
I just went in precipitation and temperature and the like.
Uh-huh.
If people are doing restoration work, or if people are doing monitoring and have certain goals of their monitoring, should they plan accordingly? Let's say have plants that are typical for the southern part of the range rather than the northern part of the range?
So that's like a big soul-searching question that's happening within the restoration community right now. And I can't say that I exactly have the answer to that, although it does seem to me like it makes sense to be mixing. Well, thank you all so much for being here.